When I made my first Monster Hunter World video, I had absolutely no plans to continue playing the game or make more videos about it. I enjoyed it, sure, but I hadn't connected with it deeply enough to feel like I needed to keep going. Then, a few days after the video went live, it started growing and growing and growing, and somehow it's now sitting at over 280,000 views, which is honestly kind of insane. I also love reading comments, all of them, and what completely pulled me in was the amount of dedication and genuine love people have for this game. Through your comments, I started to understand why Monster Hunter means so much to so many people, and more importantly, just how little of the game I had actually seen. I received an absurd amount of tips, guides and advice, but even more encouragement and appreciation for giving the game a chance. And some of you subtly suggested that I am officially a Monster Hunter YouTuber now, and there's no escape. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but Monster Hunter probably isn't going to become the only thing on this channel. However, I do have to admit that you're the reason I'm still here. Your enthusiasm for the game was so contagious that it completely infected me, and before I knew it, I had reinstalled the game and wanted to keep playing. So while Monster Hunter won't be the only thing I make videos about, I'm very glad I decided to come back. In just a few days, an entire Discord community formed around the channel, and I owe a huge part of this channel's successful start to the Monster Hunter community. So, thank you. Seriously. We are still at the very beginning of this journey, but for the first time in years, it feels like a dream I've had for a very long time might actually be becoming real. I'd also like to thank everyone who sent me fan art. I absolutely love every single piece. One of them is now my phone wallpaper, and there are a few others that I fully intend to print and frame because they are just awesome. A lot of you talked about the famous Monster Hunter click that happens once the game finally starts making sense. Maybe it's understanding the hunts, or learning the monsters, maybe it's finding the weapon that feels right. But apparently every hunter experiences that moment eventually. So I figured the smartest thing I could do was try every single weapon available in the game. Spend some time with them in the training area, take them into actual hunts, and figure out which one fits me best. My decision to start the game with Charge Blade was apparently widely approved by experienced players. What I'd like to clarify is that I had absolutely no idea it was basically one of the most technical weapons in the entire game. There was no strategy behind that choice. That was simply my natural talent for accidentally picking the hardest possible option available. I like to experience life on hard mode, you know? So, in today's video, I'm going to test all 14 weapons and finally decide which one I'll be using moving forward. Because the thought of spending dozens of hours learning one weapon only to discover later that another one would suit me better is genuinely terrifying. And before any of you get clever and skip straight to the end of the video to see what I picked, don't. Leave some room for surprises, okay? My opinions changed more than once during this experiment, and my thought process evolved quite a bit along the way. Alright hunters, grab your favorite meal from the canteen, get comfy, or uncomfy, and let's get started. But first, we have to pet Poogie, because we all know that's the most important thing in the entire game. I decided to go through all the weapons in the order they are listed in-game, which meant Great Sword was up first. Great Sword deals massive damage, but it comes at the cost of mobility. By the time you've finished winding up an attack, the monster has either moved to a different continent or knocked you unconscious. I know the weapon is all about timing, and honestly, I do like it, but I decided to eliminate it from the running for now. I did discover one really useful combo that I somehow missed during my first playthrough. Besides using the sword as a shield, you can follow a wide slash with a tackle, which not only shortens the attack animation, but also lets you absorb damage and knockback. With good timing, you can use it right as a monster attacks you. Unfortunately, good timing and I have a very complicated relationship. Next up was Long Sword, and this one immediately caught my attention. It felt smooth to move around with, the attacks were fast without feeling weak, and the combos weren't too difficult to remember. It also has the Spirit Blade mechanic, where you build up your Spirit Gauge through regular attacks before spending it on stronger moves. But the thing that got me most excited was pulling off a spirit helm breaker. The moment I ran up that training post and basically sliced it in half, I felt incredibly cool for at least 3 seconds. Plus, that attack seemed like it could be extremely useful during actual hunts. Then it was time for Sword and Shield. A lot of you recommended this as a beginner-friendly weapon, and I can absolutely see why. It has decent damage, a shield for extra safety, fast attacks, good mobility, and only a handful of combos to learn. It's the kind of weapon that lets you focus on fighting the monster instead of fighting the controls. After trying it, I completely understood the appeal, but if I'm being honest, it didn't really click with me. I don't want to sound snobbish when I say this, but it almost felt a little too straightforward. With 14 weapons to choose from, each with their own weird mechanics and playstyles, it felt like a shame not to explore some of the crazier options. So don't get me wrong, I think Sword and Shield is a great weapon, especially for beginners. It just wasn't the one that made me excited to keep experimenting. Next came dual blades, and this was actually my first real experience using them. And I have to say, I completely understand why so many people love this weapon. Man, these things are fun. The attacks are incredibly fast, you can move around constantly while attacking, and the weapon feels aggressive in the best possible way. At least until you use Demon Dance, which locks you into an animation for what feels like 5 business days and cannot be cancelled. But that's also where the most fun part of the weapon comes in, Demon Mode. Demon Mode drains a lot of stamina, so you obviously can't keep it active forever, but it makes the weapon feel even faster and more powerful. Sure, the individual hits don't deal huge amounts of damage, but when your attacks are so fast, that starts to add up pretty quickly. It was pretty obvious how much I was enjoying myself. Most of the other weapons got maybe 5 minutes of testing before I moved on, but Dual Blades somehow turned into 15 minutes of me running around, attacking random things even after I'd already learned everything I needed to learn. So just like that, I had my first favorite weapon. The problem was that there were still 10 more waiting for me. Next up was Hammer, and honestly, there's only one important thing I need to say about Hammer. Hammer goes bonk. That's it, that's the review. It's heavy, it's simple, and it bonks big time. Most of its gameplay revolves around attacks like overhead smash, big bang, charged attacks, and a few different combos. You run up to a monster and introduce its skull to several kilograms of steel. You know what? It's cool. I love all the Hammer memes. I love the sharpening my hammer jokes and the unga bunga energy. But despite all of that, I quickly realized it just isn't the weapon for me. The one weapon I never really managed to understand was Hunting Horn. I mean, I understand that its biggest strength comes from buffing stats like attack, health and defense, and I can absolutely see how valuable that would be when hunting with friends. But since I want to experience the entire story solo and only use multiplayer when I need to farm materials, I never felt particularly motivated to dive deep into it. It also didn't help that the melodies it kept playing started getting on my nerves after a while. I get the feeling that Hunting Horn has one of those learning curves where it becomes incredibly fun once everything clicks, but at that moment I was honestly more interested in moving on and seeing what the other weapons had to offer. Next up was Lance. Lance is essentially a weapon and shield combo, except the shield is really good. You can make it even stronger with things like Power Guard, so the weapon's whole identity revolves around defense, patience, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attacks are slower, the mobility isn't exactly impressive, but the damage is respectable. By the way, I should probably mention that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I have watched weapon guides, I've read tutorials, and I've tried my best to understand all of this, but half the time I feel like I'm translating ancient runes. So if anything I say sounds completely wrong, please know that I'm trying my best. My overall impression of Lance was pretty neutral. It didn't blow me away, but it didn't disappoint me either. More than anything, it just felt different from what I'm normally used to. Then there's Gun Lance, which is kind of like Lance plus explosions. It's very similar to Lance, but it also lets you fire shells and explosive attacks, which creates a pretty interesting hybrid between melee and ranged combat. You can stay up close to the monster while still having access to powerful ranged options, and I can absolutely see why that would appeal to a lot of players. For me though, I tend to prefer weapons that have a more clearly defined identity. With Gunlance, I already knew I'd probably spend half my time accidentally using the wrong attack at the wrong moment and confusing myself. Then we have Switch Axe, which can switch between two forms, Axe mode and sword mode. You can freely swap between them during combat and power up your sword attacks using file energy. I actually enjoyed this one quite a bit. The animations felt satisfying, the visual effects looked cool, and the damage wasn't bad either. For a while I was convinced it might become one of my favorites, but after a few minutes I found myself putting it away without any particularly strong feelings one way or the other. I liked it, I just didn't immediately fall in love with it. Eventually, I reached the weapon I'd been really curious about from the very beginning, Insect Glaive, mostly because it comes with a bug. And as someone with a highly sophisticated decision-making process, comes with a bug is a pretty strong selling point. The weapon uses something called a kinsect, which is basically a little insect companion that helps you during combat. Your main attacks revolve around slashes and sweeping strikes, but my favorite move was definitely Vault, where you plant your weapon into the ground and launch yourself into the air. I immediately understood why people use it to mount monsters, because it just feels incredibly cool. Then there's the Kinsect itself, which you can send toward the target to attack while you're fighting. So while you're busy swinging your weapon around, your little bug friend is also contributing damage. You can even upgrade it over time. Overall, Insect Glaive definitely caught my attention, although dual blades were still holding onto the number 1 spot in my rankings. After that, I'm going to group 3 weapons together because they are all ranged weapons. Light bowgun, heavy bowgun, and bow. Each one is unique in its own way, and one thing I immediately liked was the variety of ammo types available. Different ammo provides different advantages, many of which you'd normally need weapon upgrades, consumables, coatings, potions, or other tools to replicate on melee weapons. With ranged weapons, a lot of those options are built directly into your ammunition choices, which gives them an impressive amount of flexibility. My problem, however, is very simple. They are ranged, and historically, the only ranged combat I've ever really enjoyed involved magic staffs, wands, spellcasting, or throwing giant fireballs at mobs. Outside of that, I've always preferred fighting up close. So while I tested all 3 ranged weapons and gave them a fair chance, I went into it already suspecting that none of them were likely to become my final choice. And then, finally, we arrive at the most complicated weapon in the game, Charge Blade. I honestly think Charge Blade will always have a special place in my heart, whether that's because I genuinely love its mechanics or simply because it was the very first weapon I picked. Probably both. After watching a few guides, I started understanding it a little better, at least enough to comprehend the basics of the sword mode, X mode, charging files, using the shield properly, and not accidentally mashing buttons in blind panic. The thing about Charge Blade is that there is always something you need to keep track of. If you're not paying attention, your weapon becomes overcharged and suddenly you're bouncing off the target. Then you have to decide whether to store your files, charge your shield, charge your weapon, or eventually do all of these things at the same time. It's a weapon that constantly asks you to think ahead, and yet, despite how demanding it is, I decided to give it another chance. Because out of all 14 weapons, it still feels like the most interesting one to me. And that was every weapon. By the end of this little experiment, I'd narrowed my favorite down to 3. Longsword, dual blades, and Charge Blade. And that already felt like a huge relief. At least now I had a much better understanding of my options, and instead of being overwhelmed by 14 different weapons, I only had 3 finalists left standing. But all of this weapon testing would have been completely pointless if I never actually took them into the field. So first things first, we bet Boogie. Then I crafted a few mega potions, grabbed my dual blades and headed out on an expedition to the ancient forest. I started by bullying a few poor Aptonauts. After that I went looking for something a little more challenging. My original plan was to find a great Jagras, but instead I ran into Puke Puke. It was a slightly higher level target than I had intended, but they just made it a better test subject. Of course, with dual blades, you don't really have any form of defense, which means your primary survival strategy is simply refusing to stand where the monster is attacking. At first I was struggling with my classic technique of attacking literally everything except the monster itself, but by this point I had started learning Puke's moves, so the fight felt much more manageable. It also helped that a Radiant randomly showed up to investigate whatever chaos was happening in the area and contributed to the confusion. And most importantly, I successfully mounted a monster for the first time and I was so proud of myself. Yes! Yes! Eventually, Puke was dead, which meant it was time to test Charge Blade. The first monster I encountered was Great Jagras, which unfortunately sealed his fate. And while Charge Blade definitely hits hard, I still struggled to move around efficiently with it. I managed to kill him, but I wasn't having nearly as much fun as I had with dual blades. So after that, I switched back and decided to spend more time with them. Before continuing the story, I visited the smithy and crafted a full hunter's armor set. It looks like Daisy's riding Poogie. I also made a complete Puke set for my Palico and I was absolutely delighted with how he looked. Naturally, this gave me a completely unreasonable amount of confidence. I convinced myself that I was now properly prepared for whatever the game wanted to throw at me next, and so I accepted the next assignment. Hunting Toby Kadachi. One thing I had learned from all of you was that eating before a hunt is basically mandatory, so I grabbed a meat platter for the attack boost and headed into the ancient forest. To be completely honest, I expected Toby Kadachi to be a minor inconvenience. You know, one of those monsters you defeat quickly before moving on to the real problem. Well, turns out Toby Kadachi was the real problem. I climbed all the way up to its nest and immediately started receiving what can only be described as a professional grade beating. The biggest issue was that my armor wasn't strong enough, which meant almost every hit took away a huge amount of health. On top of that, Toby uses powerful thunder attacks, loves to launch itself through the air, throws its tail around, and seems deeply committed to pretending it's some kind of electric sugar glider. So after a short but educational experience, I fainted. I did manage to mount it on my second attempt, which felt amazing for approximately 3 seconds before I remembered I was still losing the fight. Despite landing plenty of attacks and dealing visible damage, I simply wasn't equipped to handle the punishment it was dishing out. At that point, it became very clear what I needed to do. I needed better gear. More specifically, I needed better armor. Since Puke hadn't felt particularly difficult, I initially decided to farm materials for a complete Puke armor set. That seemed like a reasonable plan, right up until I proudly announced it on Discord and learned that every piece of Puke armor comes with a thunder resistance penalty. In fact, wearing the entire set would leave me with a total of -15 thunder resistance. So I moved up a level and headed to the Wildspire Waste to hunt Barroth instead. Honestly, I find this situation pretty funny. After my first encounter with Barroth, I distinctly remember thinking, I never want to fight this thing again. And now here I was, voluntarily farming him for materials. It makes me wonder how many times I will eventually say the exact same thing about Anjanath. I also decided to follow another piece of advice that a lot of you had given me. Defeat every monster solo the first time, but bring help when grinding materials afterward. That way you still get the satisfaction of overcoming the challenge yourself without turning the farming process into a second full-time job. So I invited my boyfriend to join me. Partly because I recently bought him the game and felt it was only fair that he suffer alongside me. Not that I didn't have plenty of people willing to play with me. The Monster Hunter community has been incredibly welcoming. But, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a huge introvert and I feel most comfortable playing with people I already know well. The next several hours were spent hunting pretty much everything we could find. Guluyaku, Juratodus, and most frequently Barroth. I also crafted this absolutely incredible Westpoint armor set made from those giant mosquito-like creatures whose sole purpose in life seems to be annoying everyone around them. My Palico got a shiny new Geratodus armor set as well, and together we looked significantly more prepared than we actually were. The reason we spent so much time hunting Barot was because I desperately needed his tail to complete my gear set. 3 entire hunts were basically dedicated to obtaining a single stubborn piece of monster anatomy. Since cutting tails generally favors bigger weapons with heavier hits, I switched back to Charge Blade. Unfortunately, Charge Blade and I were still having our ongoing disagreement about timing and competence. So eventually I returned to my beloved Greatsword, the Penetrator. After a few more attempts, a few more hunts, and a few more questionable decisions, I finally had everything I needed. And you know what? Rather than depriving you of all the best moments from those adventures, here's a little montage. I'm speaking my native language, Czech, so I'll make sure to add subtitles for you. Jenže teďka je po mně Ratian, do prdele. Ne, dobrý, nejde. Čau, kámo. Oh shit! Oh! Jak ty na něj jedeš? Slade! Teďka špinka. Pičit! Já jsem nahoře. Už se zase perou s Barotem, ne? Jej. Píči, debil jeden. Yes! Pojď do kaktusa. Yes! To je skvělý. Yes! Čekat mi uletěl. Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh no. Whoa! And finally, I was ready for Tobi Kadachi. Well, almost. I still ran around taking care of a few last-minute upgrades. I improved my armor, upgraded my weapon, swapped out my old bone blades for a Geratodus weapon with water damage, ate a big meal, and mentally prepared myself for what I assumed would be my next death. Tobi Kadachi is one of those monsters that I genuinely feel bad about hunting. Because if you spend a few minutes just watching him, he's actually kind of adorable. He's also completely passive. As long as you leave him alone, he will happily go about his day without causing any trouble. Unfortunately for him, I had a quest. This time I came much better prepared. I learned that he's vulnerable. I learned that he's vulnerable to poison, so I brought poison knives and a few poison smoke bombs with me. Don't get me wrong, he was still beating me up on a regular basis. But thanks to my new Barrett armor, those hits weren't nearly as devastating as they had been before. I also started paying much more attention to the environment around me. For example, I dumped poison cups directly in his path, which he seemed surprisingly unhappy about. And whenever he got knocked down, I immediately switched into full goblin mode and attacked him with absolutely no regard for my own safety. And I have to say, I think you're going to enjoy the way I finally managed to finish him off. I love this feeling. The process of improving my gear, learning a monster's behavior, understanding its weaknesses, figuring out how to use the environment to my advantage, and then finally putting all of that knowledge together to win. I think that's one of the biggest reasons people get hooked on Monster Hunter. The challenge is real, yes, but the sense of improvement is incredibly rewarding. Every victory feels earned. So, Tobi Kadachi was finally behind me. Anjanat, however, was a completely different problem, and mentally I was nowhere near ready for that encounter. So instead, I invited my boyfriend back and we spent some time farming Tobi together. And while we are on the topic, I'd actually like to share some thoughts about hunting monsters in multiplayer. Personally, I enjoy multiplayer much more than solo hunts, but it definitely comes with its own challenges. One thing I noticed almost immediately was how much harder it became to predict the monster's behavior. When you're playing solo, the monster is mostly focused on you, which makes its movements easier to read. You can start recognizing patterns, predicting attacks, and planning your positioning. In multiplayer though, the monster suddenly has several targets to choose from and it changes its mind every 5 seconds. One moment it's attacking your friend, the next moment it's attacking your palico, and the moment after that it's somehow launching itself directly at your face. Because of that, I found it much harder to time my attacks properly, predict where the monster would move next, or know when it was actually safe to commit to an attack. During multiplayer hunts, I dealt significantly less damage than I did when fighting solo, and spent a lot more time running around while Tobi treated me like a volleyball. So once again, I completely understand why so many experienced players recommend defeating a monster solo first. You learn so much more about its behavior, and once you've proven you can beat it on your own, multiplayer becomes a fun way to farm materials rather than a chaotic lesson in survival. But you know what is important? Petting Poogie. Always petting Poogie. And if I'm being completely honest, one of the main reasons I farmed Tobi Kadachi so many times was because of the armor. Not my armor, my Palico's armor. I mean, sure, I look pretty good too, but would you please look at this little guy? This is genuinely the most adorable armor set I've seen in the game so far. He looks absolutely incredible. Every time he runs past me, I get distracted by how ridiculously cute he is. At this point, I'm not even sure I'm collecting armor for myself anymore. I think I'm just playing fashion hunter for my cat. So, what are my final thoughts? Well, I originally expected this experiment to end with me choosing one weapon and never looking back. That did not happen. The reality is a little more complicated, especially when you're just starting out and suddenly have 14 different weapons to choose from. The more I played, the more I realized that not every weapon is equally useful against every monster. For example, the dual blades that I've been using aren't always going to be the best option against flying monsters, while they are fantastic against monsters that stay on the ground and move around a lot. On top of that, during the several hours my boyfriend and I spent farming materials, I started developing an appreciation for his weapon, Insect Glaive. And look, before we get into any of the mechanics, I think it's important to acknowledge the most important feature. It comes with a bug, a little bug friend that follows you around, and that alone earns points. But what I really fell in love with was the mobility. The vault ability lets you launch yourself into the air, making it much easier to mount monsters. And I had an absurd amount of fun watching my boyfriend jump onto a monster and ride away several times during a single hunt. At one point, I started joking that he'd found himself a new pet. Meanwhile, I was sitting there wishing I had that many opportunities to mount monsters myself. Technically, you can mount monsters with dual blades. The problem is that first you need to find a ledge, slope, tree, wall or some other piece of terrain that lets you jump. Then you need to actually hit the monster before it decides to leave the area, starts attacking someone else or launch you into orbit. With Insect Glaive, you just press a button near the monster and suddenly you're airborne. It's so much easier. Of course, it has its downsides too. It deals a bit less damage than some other weapons, and I've heard that it works differently in Monster Hunter Rise. Apparently a lot of people who loved it in World struggled to adjust when they switched games. As for dual blades, there's really only one thing that annoys me. Some of the longer attacks animations. Once you've committed to certain moves, you're committed, which means there have been plenty of moments where I've watched a monster wind up and attack while my character continued spinning around like a blender. So I think I've ended up with a trio of weapons that I'll be using moving forward. Dual blades as my main weapon, greatsword whenever I need huge damage or want to cut off something important, like a tail, and insect glaive for flying monsters. Generally speaking, I enjoy speed and mobility far more than slow heavy attacks, so greatsword will probably be more of a situational choice than a regular one, which means you'll most likely see me either running around in demon mode with dual blades or launching myself into the sky with insect glaive, while attempting to turn giant monsters into emotional support animals. I don't think it's going to work, but I can still try. And you know what that means for next time? Anjanath, a giant, terrifying dinosaur that everyone keeps warning me about. And I'm scared. A lot of people describe Anjanath as the first real wall they hit in Monster Hunter. One comment said they uninstalled the game 4 separate times before finally beating him. Meanwhile, my boyfriend somehow killed him on his second attempt, which frankly feels a little suspicious. Knowing myself though, I'm probably going to spend quite a few hours getting repeatedly humbled before I manage to bring him down. I've definitely become more familiar with the game since my first video, but let's be honest, my skill issue is still alive and well. So if you'd like to watch me struggle against a giant fire-breathing dinosaur while desperately trying to convince myself that everything is under control, keep an eye out for the next Monster Hunter video. I won't be uploading them constantly because I also want to make other types of content, but I'm pretty sure this is a game I'll keep coming back to. Every time I return, there's something new to learn, another challenge to overcome, and another opportunity to push myself a little further outside my comfort zone. And before I go, thank you so much for watching. I know there are millions of videos on YouTube competing for your attention, and the fact that you clicked on this one and stayed all the way until the end genuinely means a lot to me. I'll keep doing my best to make videos that are worth your time. So with that, thank you so much for being here, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.